welcome to the Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Ahmed and
Jayden Garcia.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Westin MCAT podcast with Ahmed and Jayden. Today, we'll be talking about maybe a recent experience of mine that's MCAT relevant, talking about how altitude essentially kind of messes with our bodies and, how we adjust and, what the applications of that are with respect to the MCAT. Before we dive into that, Jayden, it's been a while. How are things? I know you've been busy, but hopefully well.
Well, yeah, I've talked before about this process being a bunch of ups and downs.
Yeah.
And time commitments going up and down. And I just finished what you could consider to be the most arduous, busy rotation of my entire medical training. So knowing that that's behind me is like really great. It's really,
I can imagine.
it's awesome. And now I'm on a rotation where I'm, getting home around like 5 p.m. at night, 5:30, which is really great. Not having to wake up insane hours. So I'm doing really well on that.
Yeah, that's great. So for context, right? Like right now you're doing probably like 7 to 5, 8 to 5.
Yeah, so I probably get in the hospital around 7:30, somewhere around there. And
Okay.
yeah, finish at like normal clinic hours around 5. So feel like a normal person a little bit.
Yeah. And so what were the hours before? Like what was this rotation entailing?
Yeah, that one, I would wake up around somewhere between 3:30 and 4:30, kind of depending. I'd be in the hospital shortly after that. And I could leave as late as 10 or 11 p.m. It wasn't uncommon to do
Oh
that.
my God.
It
Oh
wasn't every
man.
day, but it was a lot of days, and all it takes is one of those days to like throw you off for the rest of the week into like a deficit.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm glad it's done. It was super rewarding, lots of great operating experience, but your body needs a change after 10 weeks. That was 10 straight weeks of that. So
Oh wow.
yeah,
That's a lot, man.
that's why it's been
That's
hard to get a hold of me.
well, I mean, that's you made it. We'll
We
just
did
focus
it.
on that. The worst is behind you, better days
We did it.
ahead. So,
You
hey,
get
man.
through it. You always do. It's just, and you look back and I think this is for everybody at any stage, whether it was studying for the MCAT or it's applying to med school or doing med school. You look back and you're always like, wow, I don't want to do that again, but if I had to, I probably could.
Yeah, and I think, and this is something I'll touch on today, is like you don't know what you're capable of until you try,
Yep.
right? And then once you've done it, it's like, okay, I know for a fact I can
Mm.
do X, right? And
Yep.
it's different when it's like, I think I can. I've just never been there before, right?
Yeah.
And it's a lot easier to push yourself when you know you've done something when rather than when you're pushing for like new bounds, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think for you anyway, going forward, there's probably an added sense of confidence of like, okay, yeah, I've been through that. I
Yeah.
know like I can handle a little bit more now,
Yeah.
like or more than I'm used to. So in that respect, I think you came out on top.
Thanks, man. What about you? Tell us all what's been going on in your life, man.
Yeah, so I am currently in Ecuador, and I'll come back to that in a second. My life's been good. It's been very busy. November is Cyber Month here at Westin, so we have this big sale going on, which means an influx of prospective students that I have the privilege of meeting with. And so for context, and I want to look at the exact numbers because I don't want to make anything up, but like I've worked, no, I don't want to say a ridiculous number of hours because you've worked a ridiculous number of hours,
Oh,
but like for me, like for context, like since I've started school, I've worked anywhere between, high 50s to low 60s hours per month. right, per month. So we're talking like max like 15 hours a week.
It's
Like,
still on top of school.
but
That's
like keep in mind that's logged hours. This includes, time I'm allocated for my prep, right? Things that I'm doing offline. So actual working hours is probably closer to 50, let's say. It is on the date of filming, November 19th. And for November, I'm already at 80. So
wow.
that's been busy. Um, but the other thing that's been cool is I've been traveling this month for a couple of squash tournaments. I just finished up a tournament out in Edmonton, Alberta. I was fortunate enough to make the semis there. And then, um, it's been I'm never going to be a travel agent. Let's just start with that. I have absolutely shot myself in the foot with this travel itinerary. And I think, for context, one of the things that's really challenging when traveling for tournaments is you're trying to estimate when might you exit the tournament. And so you plan your return accordingly. And so I was hoping in this Edmonton tournament to make the final. I ended up losing in the semis. I would have been able to go home on the Saturday, but I stayed until the Sunday
Oh,
at like 6 p.m. local time. So I landed in Toronto, where I live, at midnight local time. The problem with that is my flight to Ecuador was Monday morning at 8 a.m.
ooh,
And so my thought was like, okay, you know what? No problem. I'll post up in the lounge, like the airport lounge. That'll be fine. I'll take a nap. We'll survive. Not only does the lounge not open until 5:30, they don't let you pass security until 3. And so I'm in this conundrum of, do I go home and sleep for 3
mm,
hours or do I stay at the airport? Stayed at the airport. And I'm like, you know what? It's okay. I got myself an energy drink and that actually powered me through the entire night, which I was pleasantly surprised by because it was only 80 milligrams of caffeine, or yeah, uh, milligrams or micrograms? Milligrams,
I think
right?
it's milligrams.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
micrograms is nothing.
Yeah, okay. I don't know why I was confused there for a second, but anyway, it's time to board the flight and there's no flight crew. And
Mm,
so they had like a medical emergency. And so we didn't end up taking off until 1. And so the hindsight bias in me was like, I knew I should have gone home. But
hmm
anyway, so yeah, we ended up, and so this is actually a little bit off topic, but like for anyone that, like stresses lots of minor details like I do, I was really irritated when I was booking this trip because there was a flight that would get me to Ecuador at 4:55, right? There was a connection in the middle, which would have been perfect. But because I was slow, the price got jacked up like a lot. And so I ended up settling for one that got me here at about 10 p.m. I was really upset, really disappointed. But had I booked that other one, I actually would have missed that flight. So that was a nice, like, hey, you know what? Worked out kind
It
of
worked
moment.
out.
But in any case, yeah, like I said, I came here for this tournament. I unfortunately lost in the first round, and we'll kind of get into some of the science behind that. Tomorrow, though, I start the 24-hour journey home, and that'll be an experience in and of itself. But
No, man, that's crazy. How do you do this? My hat's again off to you. It's very impressive for you to be able to compete at this high of a level as a medical student and an employee still. You're still working lots of hours. I think it's a good testament to everybody listening. I was in a similar boat. You can do a lot during medical school and you can push yourself more than you think. And if somebody tells you you can't do it, go out of your way to show them you can.
yeah,
So just again, my very
appreciate
impressive.
it, man. And I do want to acknowledge like there's always a trade-off that you have to
Yep.
make. Like I'm not gunning for 100% in medical school. Like I'm gunning for pass plus 7%.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a decision I'm comfortable with because it enables me to do other things in my life, other things that matter to me, like working, like playing squash at a high level. And to your point, like when somebody tells you you can't do something, it's just extra fire. the number of times that I've been told, hey, you can't play pro squash in med school is, more than I can count. Granted, it is extremely difficult, and I wouldn't say I've had a ton of success on tour yet, but I really feel as if it's a matter of when, not if. And it's one of those things that, like, if you want something badly enough, you can find a way to make it happen. And so for our viewers or our listeners, when you get into medical school, reflect on, like, what are those core parts of your identity that make you you, and just find ways not to compromise those, or at least not to sacrifice too much,
Yeah.
because I think there's always ways that you can make things work while still, eating healthy, getting a good night's sleep, all that kind of stuff. So it's
I
just,
have to put in one more plug because I feel like this is super important.
yeah, yeah.
Maybe we should do an entire episode on this at some point, but I'm in the middle of residency selection. I'm on the committee this year.
Oh,
Uh,
nice.
I've shared with you in the past, I did it for medical school. I really enjoy this type of work, but I'll tell you, it's hard because you get so many amazing people and you can't necessarily think highly of all of them, even though they're extremely qualified.
Right.
Um, the plug is you said you're not gunning for, let's see, hold on one sec, my computer reminded. Okay. You said that you're not gunning for 100% on tests. And I think that's actually very wise because at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, what is going to separate me from other people? Because even though we're all friends in med school, people do become your competitors and you don't need to see them that way. But you also need to recognize that somebody's going to read your application going into med school or residency, and you're just going to need to stand out. And nobody's going to choose somebody who got a couple extra points on a test over somebody who's playing pro squash in the middle of medical school. That's how you stand out to a selections committee. That is how you advance yourself above other people, so that you can get into med school, so that you can get into the residency or fellowship or whatever it is. So had to put a plug in for that. That would stand out to our admissions committee. You know what I mean? And I
Yeah, and
think
I think
people, yeah, go ahead.
couple things there. Number one, I hope you're there in 3 years' time when I'm applying to residencies. Just, I know you're supposed to be done. Actually, no, you'll still be there at that point, right? This is your second year of your residency.
Yes, I'll still be there. If you're interested in ENT, man.
Hey, stay on that committee, do a good job, right? No, but jokes aside, I think, there are two other just brief points on that note, before we dive into the science of our discussion today. Number one, like, when a residency sees my transcript, it just says pass fail. So to them, I'm no different than anybody else,
Yeah.
better or worse, right? So my grades, you know, mean nothing to them. Where my grades matter to me personally is I want to be knowledgeable on, the things that I'm interested in, right? Because when you get to medical school, you're learning to learn, not to, get 100%, right? And so full transparency, right? Our last exam, and we have exams in like 2 to 3 week little clusters, so they're not huge, but our last one was pediatrics and health promotion. There's a little bit of like exercise science and the health promotion stuff, but like I know deep to my core that I do not want to be a pediatrician. And so was I going to commit time to memorizing all these developmental milestones? Probably not, right? Like I knew enough to pass. I passed, check, on to the next.
Hmm.
The unfortunate thing for me is now we're in microbiome. And do I want to
Hmm.
be a microbiologist? No. Do I love learning about all these different bacteria, fungi, viruses, etc.? Not particularly. But again, it's one of those things where you do enough to get out of it what you want, and then you can push forward. And I think it's just a mindset that, like you said, Jayden, it's wise to adopt because you'll be able to pursue other things. Um, the last thing I just wanted to point out, like, don't take like my story there as like a sign that you have to do something grandiose or anything like that.
Hmm.
Because really, like at its core, like I signed up for a tournament, I got into it, and I was allowed to play. It's really like that's what it is at its core. But what I want you guys to take away from this is I just followed something that I've been passionate about for a long time. Like this is not
Yep.
something new necessarily. This is something that I've been doing. It's a sport that I've been playing, and it's something that keeps me going in medical school, right? It gives me an outlet, right? So that's why I said earlier, find the things that are the core parts of your identity and, continue with them, right?
Yep.
Because, it's gotten you this far. Clearly it's worked, right? But have those unique elements that, make you who you are that you can present to medical schools, to residencies down the road. But in any case, speaking of this trip, I was just telling you off air there, Jayden, that one of the most difficult parts of this tournament for me was competing at altitude.
Mm,
And for context, right? Quito, which is where I'm at, is 2,850 meters, which is somewhere between 9 and 10,000 feet,
yeah.
right? So for context, Denver is mile high, right? Denver's 5,200 feet. An airplane cabin is pressurized to 8,000 feet. So I'm competing at higher than an airplane altitude, essentially.
Hmm. And
Uh,
I think at Mount Everest is like, it's like, oh man, 30.
Everest, I want to say, is like 28 to 29,000 feet.
Yeah, I want to say it's somewhere around there. So I mean, it's impressive, like what you're in, just for context.
We're one third of the way, more than one
Yeah.
third of the way up Mount Everest.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so it's interesting, right? Because the science behind it is, when you go to altitude, a couple of things happen. And it's important for us to think about this in an acute and a more, I don't
Hmm.
want to say chronic, but subacute stage, right? An acute hypoxia, which is what altitude essentially is, right? So maybe let's probe that for a second. The percentage of oxygen in the air doesn't change. No matter where you are, it's always 20%. The problem here in keto is that the overall pressure of gas in the environment is about 30% lower than sea level, which is where I live, unfortunately. You'll see why I say unfortunately in a minute. But, at sea level, we're about 760 millimeters of mercury. In keto, if I remember correctly, we're somewhere in the realm of like 540 millimeters of mercury.
Hmm.
And so there's effectively 30% less oxygen in the air. So a couple things happen. Number one, we hyperventilate, right, to
Hmm.
try to bring in higher volumes of air to get in enough oxygen, right? Like if I move more air and there's less oxygen per breath, I can balance it out, right, by bringing in extra air. The problem with that is we exhale carbon dioxide, which is the main driver of respiration in the human body. We measure CO2, right, and not oxygen. And so you end up getting into this funky middle ground where your body wants you to breathe less, right? Specifically, your blood wants you to breathe less because, the pH is out of whack, but your muscles want you to breathe more because they're not getting enough oxygen. And so that's actually what leads into altitude sickness is, your pH is thrown off for, usually that sets in at about the 20-minute mark and stays that way for like 1 to 2 days until your body compensates by paying out bicarbonate. But that's the big picture. Over time, though, your body adapts by releasing more EPO, which is the hormone that, triggers the growth of red blood cells. And so for somebody who lives at high altitude, their hemoglobin is going to be extremely high because that's a physiological adaptation to, living at altitude. So now when they compete, be it at altitude or at sea level, it provides a profound advantage. That advantage at sea level isn't as big because everybody's well oxygenated. At altitude, it makes a big difference. And we'll get into that in a second. But from an MCAT relevant standpoint, Jayden, what of the things that I just said really stands out?
So much here. And I think when we decided on this topic, I was super excited because I feel like this is one that ties endless amounts
Absolutely.
of
Yeah.
principles from the MCAT, but also very practical relations to human physiology and taking care of actual patients. These
Right.
are principles when I was in the surgical ICU, thinking about when I had patients with these problems come in. And the last thing I'll say on that is uh, it is amazing how these principles are your foundation for building upon. And I think when I go through this, you're going to see that you've probably at some point decided that some of this stuff is nonsense. Why do I need to be studying this to be a doctor?
Right.
But I can't tell you how many times I look back and maybe I didn't need to know every bit of pushing, electrons and stuff in an organic chemistry equation, but there's so many foundational principles that translates to basic knowledge, medical school foundation going forward. So to
Right.
go back, MCAT relevant principles, the idea of partial pressures, super,
Yep.
super relevant in a mixture of gas or multiple gases in an environment. There are individual pressures of each of those gases that lead up to let's say we're at atmosphere, the 760 millimeters of mercury.
Right.
There's oxygen in there. There's nitrogen, primarily. Those are the two. And Dalton's law would tell us that individually, each of those pressures are going to add up to 760. Um, and then what is a partial pressure? It is some percentage or fraction of whatever gases are out there, um, times by the total system pressure.
Right.
So if we think about oxygen, how do we get that? I think I forgot how much you said in keto you have. I think you
Like,
gave the total atmospheric pressure of like, was it 200 and something? 300,
uh,
500,
540 about.
540. So like at sea level, we're at 760. You're sitting in California, literally on the sea
Right.
level. You're at 760. You're in keto, you're at 560, but only 21% of that 560 is the pressure of oxygen. So
Yeah.
very quickly you can determine what is the 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 pressure of oxygen, and that same pressure is going to be what our alveoli, the tiny sacs in the lungs that see that pressure, that's what it's going to be. So 21% of the 500 is what you were seeing in the middle of that squash match. That
Yeah.
is tremendously less than it's like I think it's around 200 if you're in California, 200
Um,
millimeters of mercury or something like that.
yeah, it's so
Do
yeah,
the
it's
math.
interesting.
21% of 760.
About 160.
Yes.
And of that 160, we only really get 100 or so to the level of the alveoli.
Yep.
But
Because there's dead space. We're not able to filter everything into the alveoli. And so
exactly.
our margin of error is pretty small. And then when you go to a place like keto, even smaller. So that's
Yeah.
partial pressures. And remember, you need a pressure to drive oxygen into the blood. Blood is
Yeah.
passing through this alveolus, or next to this alveolus, and it relies on a pressure, a positive pressure, to push essentially oxygen the into the bloodstream. So what happens is, to your point, we get hypoxic. We're not getting the same amount of oxygen into the blood. And in order to get out of a state of hypoxia, we just have to breathe more.
Yeah.
And that's where like Le Chatelier's principle comes in. If CO2 is going down because we're blowing it all off in the middle of a squash match, your bicarbonate levels become incredibly high, which alters the pH level in the blood.
And just a quick note there, Jayden. We're discussing the bicarbonate buffer system there, which is another extremely
Yet
high
another
yield
impact.
topic.
Because what if you take that buffer system away, which the buffer system is composed, maybe this is a little past MCAT, but hopefully it provides context. the buffer system is essentially hemoglobin that is able to change configurations to pick up protons, pick up bicarbonate. And that is essentially the buffer. We use this term buffer, but it's actually red blood cells carrying hemoglobin that acts as a
Right.
buffer system. You take that away, somebody becomes alkalotic incredibly fast and they would die.
Yeah.
So
It,
you have to have that there, or these massive changes in CO2 would kill us fast.
yeah.
Um, and so you're getting rid of CO2, you're building up bicarbonate. We know that proteins work in a particular pH. And so you're starting to see all sorts of proteins malfunction. That leads to nausea, that leads to headache. When these proteins start to break down, then you start to lose oncotic pressure. This is
Yeah.
another, very common tested MCAT question, right? Proteins build up an oncotic pressure that drives fluid in and out of space, in and out of the brain, for example. If there's too
Yeah.
little oncotic pressure in the brain because certain proteins aren't surviving under these conditions, what happens? Hydrostatic pressure is going to push in fluid into the brain. And then
Yeah.
you get a pretty significant, which I've seen, complication of altitude sickness, which is um,
ACE, right? High
ACE,
altitude cerebral
exactly,
edema.
cerebral edema.
Yeah.
I think it stands specifically for high altitude cerebral edema.
Exactly.
The
Yeah.
same problem can happen in the lungs. Now you're pushing fluid into the lungs because we're
Pain.
losing oncotic pressure.
Yep.
So see how many things are tying in here? It's fantastic. Um,
Yeah.
any thoughts on that? I mean, I could keep going, but it's just
No,
there's
I mean,
so many principles here.
you're hitting the nail on the head. And, students might wonder, okay, this all sounds so bad. Like, how does anybody go to altitude, right?
Mhm.
Like how can you play at altitude if you don't live there? And so this is where things get really interesting, because there are altitude sickness drugs that you can take in advance of going to altitude to make your life easier. How do they work? The most popular one is acetazolamide, which helps you essentially eliminate bicarbonate from the kidneys, which shifts that pH buffer system to the right so that you have an unnecessarily acidic blood. That way, when you go to altitude and you hyperventilate, you're not lowering your blood pH, you're resetting it to normal, right? Now, here's the problem with acetazolamide for somebody like myself. Acetazolamide is a banned substance by WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency. Okay. Why is it a banned substance? Not for the reason that you would think. It is not a performance enhancing drug. It's a diuretic. Okay. So it makes you pee, right? And we know that based on the mechanism of how it works, right? It helps you pee out bicarbonate. The issue with diuretics is by peeing more, you're diluting, right, your urine sample. And so if you're doping with anything else, it's much harder to detect. And so this is a conversation that I had, and this would be a great, Casper question for any of our listeners that have to take the Casper exam. Okay, so imagine this scenario. You are traveling to altitude. This is entirely hypothetical. I want to put that out there right now. You're traveling to altitude. You are playing or competing against an individual or a team of individuals that are from the local community and well acclimatized. You yourself have no history of doping and are not currently doping. And you're pondering whether or not it is ethically defensible to take this altitude mountain sickness drug. Explain, or your friend is pondering this scenario. Explain what you would tell your friend. And so, not to get into the realm of Casper too much, but you can see how this, on a very minor scale, is an ethical dilemma. Full transparency, I did not end up taking acetazolamide, but um, it's one of those things where, like, unfortunately, there's no better, altitude alleviating agent other than just acclimatization, getting there earlier, right? But as a medical student, on a student budget, right? We can't all afford to take an extra 4 days in South America, right? So
Mhm.
it's just another interesting real world application there. And it connects back to the buffer system that we spent a lot of time talking about there, right? The way we fix the problem is by getting rid of the bicarbonate so that, we can anticipate, some changes that are coming down the pipeline. Um, and that I feel would be an interesting research project is, can you find a way to lower your blood pH through a mechanism other than a diuretic? Because then you're not in violation of, any anti-doping principle, but you're also helping out the athletes heading to altitude. But yeah, there's so much going on there, and a lot of it does come back to that bicarbonate buffer system that we were talking about. Uh, and it's interesting to study that science and then live that science, because one of the things we were talking about as well is like my O2 saturation plummeted as I was competing. Like I hit at the lowest point, I think 91 or 92%, which for any of you who have ever watched Grey's Anatomy or The Resident or anything like that, know is extremely low, right? Like at baseline, we're roughly 98%, and like you're borderline lethal at about 88%. Is that accurate, Jin? Maybe a little bit lower?
Of O2 sat, it's very complicated. I've literally seen patients with an O2 sat of 1 or 0.
Oh,
I think
geez, that's not
I
good.
think I was in the OR the other day. A baby's sat was like 1%, 0. It can so big. This is getting fun now. I think this is another important MCAT principle of like the oxyhemoglobin curve, right?
Yeah,
For you, a healthy person, to see a drop down to like 90% or near 90%, if you look at that curve, the amount of millimeters of mercury you would have had to have lost to even go down that little, because it kind of plateaus, right? It
yeah,
looks like this, and you lose a little bit more, you could very quickly just steeply drop your O2 sat.
yeah.
I'll tell you, people live in the 80s all the time, especially with underlying pulmonary disease like
Right,
COPD,
right.
emphysema, etc. Um, but for somebody healthy like you, you're going to feel a significant difference being at 92 compared to
Yeah,
99, 100% where you live, right? Your body's always relative. I deal a lot with relative change with airway disorders. I
yeah,
could look at one person like you who has a nice airway, and if I were to make it half as small, you would still have an airway significantly bigger than most of my patients. But
yeah.
I could bring in somebody, one of my patients with the same size airway, really tiny, small, and they're not nearly as symptomatic. And again, it's this acclimatization factor. The body's remarkable at adapting over time, and people become very sick and symptomatic with significant relative change.
Right. Yeah, I mean it's one of those things too. I think when I say borderline lethal, the underlying or the concurrent health considerations there are a factor, right? Because it's not necessarily that being at 88% is lethal, it's sort of the trajectory that you're headed on. And
Mm,
so if somebody has COPD, for example, right? Your alveolar membranes are so much thicker, right? You're not going to bring in as much oxygen, right? So that's sort of the baseline for that patient. But you take a normal, healthy individual, right? Getting down below a certain point is extremely atypical, right? And
mm.
that, physiological response can have its own set of, complications. But all of that is to say, I'm good and well, thankfully, but it's one of those things where like you have to acclimatize, because if you don't stand a chance. And so for myself today, I played a local from Ecuador, and it was, I don't want to say it was no contest, but there were times where it certainly felt no contest.
Hmm.
And, it's it's amazing how, at a chemical level, right, our bodies have these adaptations that lead to such profound macroscopic effects, right? And it's just always been something that's intrigued me, like how, you know, performance changes under different conditions, right? Whether it be altitude or hyperbaria being, under deep pressures or, things of that nature. But you know, it's one of the things that I really hope is coming across is like just how much fun it can be to learn when you're passionate about what you're learning, you know? And like for me, like growing up playing sports, like I've always been intrigued by, all right, well, how can you get a competitive edge, right? In the most, legal and ethical way possible. Uh, and how altitude plays into that, right? And the benefits of altitude training, is just one of those things. But I think from an MCAT standpoint, right, as we talked about, you want to understand, the applications to the bicarbonate buffer system, how that's somewhat closely related to, the oxyhemoglobin saturation curve, the role that hyperventilation and respiration in general play in regulating blood pH, right? Those are all essential concepts, and we can branch out from there, right? We can get into equilibrium, right? And that opens up a whole Pandora's box, right? Now you're talking acid-base chemistry, solubility, you can get into amino acids, right?
Hmm.
You know, uh, we can talk about, ions and charges, right? That gets us into the whole electrostatics realm. So, uh, that's the one thing that I hope a lot of students appreciate about the MCAT as well is how easy it can be to branch out from just a central node, right? Like you start with a central topic, you can connect a lot of different things together there. And it just makes studying easier, right? When you can see the relationships.
Yeah. And as you were talking, Ahmed, one last tie, I think, to this that I think is pretty important that ties into treatment and why we do this in the first
Yeah.
place. We talked about acetazolamide as a treatment for or a prophylactic measure for altitude sickness. Going back to this idea of partial pressures, um, one of the things you can do, there's a big equation or a really important equation that is outside the scope of the MCAT, but super relevant for med school. If you haven't heard it already, Ahmed, it's coming very soon. You're at that microbiology section, if I feel like cardiac and respiratory physiology is just around the corner. So
They're coming down the pipe for sure.
it's just like the natural path of medicine, medical training. But anyways, the alveolar gas equation is essentially a tie into all of this. Um, if I remember correctly, you take the fraction of inspired oxygen, this 21% that is room air,
Yep.
that doesn't change, as Ahmed said, I can't emphasize that enough. It doesn't change. Um, And then you have on the same side of the equation, essentially atmospheric pressure of 760, which is sea level minus what you're actually at. So if you're at sea level, there's no difference.
Yep.
Somewhere like where you are, there's a pretty significant, that number really starts to shrink. But the one thing you can do, and you'll see people if they go on significant hikes or Mount Everest climbing, you name it, is they travel with oxygen, 100% FiO2. So
Yep.
our listeners probably like, I thought you said that because it can't change. So the air composition can't change of normal
Yeah.
air,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
can put a nasal cannula in your nose and blast you with non-normal air. I can give
Yeah.
100% FiO2, fraction of inspired oxygen,
Yep.
and that changes that alveolar gas equation. I can't change the atmosphere,
Tremendously.
right? I can't change the pressure of the whole system that we're in or our environment, but I can change how much oxygen percentage your nares, right? Your nose is seeing. And I do that by oxygen therapy. It's the first line of any patient who becomes hypoxic. Throw on
Right.
some oxygen. It doesn't always work for all the underlying problems, but it's the first go-to. And so people should, if they get mountain sick, altitude sick, they should travel with an oxygen tank.
Yeah, and I mean that's the solution legally from a
Yeah.
doping standpoint, right? And but where it gets interesting is like, we'll all, or I shouldn't say all, but like I'm sure we've often seen, that image of, the large football player just waddling over to the oxygen mask in a game at sea level, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't do anything, right? Because if you're at
Yeah.
sea level, you're already at the highest part of the curve, right? And a couple of quick breaths in, you've already resaturated, right?
Hmm.
But when you're at, you know, a PO2, so for context, right? We talked about PO2, right? And the lungs getting to about 100, right? In keto, if you were to take 21% of 540, we're already at 100, right? And that's just in the atmosphere, right? That's not what's getting to the lungs. And so what's getting to the lungs, right? We roughly have a dead space of about 35% ish, right? 35% of 100 is 35. So there's about 65 millimeters of mercury potentially getting to the lungs, right? Which, if you look at the oxyhemoglobin saturation curve, right, can make a big difference. But, uh, it's like I said, it's something that has so many real world applications. And to your point, Jayden, right? Like it's so intricately related to a number of concepts with MCAT relevance. Uh, and blasting at high FiO2 is one solution, right? We talked about excreting, bicarbonate so that we can have these anticipatory changes. Um, and so maybe one other thing that hopefully is illustrated in this discussion is, the nuance of problem solving in healthcare and medicine from a treatment standpoint.
Hmm.
Uh, and it's important to be able to think somewhat creatively, right? And not be sort of stagnant in this is how things are done, right? You always want to be innovative because, medicine is a dynamic field. And, as future physicians, um, it's important for us to be at the forefront of that innovation and avoiding, just stagnation like I talked about.
Yeah. This is a great topic. I want to reemphasize, if you hung with us here, you understood part of this, you should be proud of yourself, because that
Yeah,
means that you have come to an understanding of principles that are key to being a physician. And all of those classes that you may feel are not relevant, are not helpful, why am I studying this? We just probably dropped 25 different principles that most listeners probably understand when listening to this. So, congratulations, keep going. You're building a foundation, even if you don't see it, because take all of these principles away that you should have picked up in an undergraduate setting. You could imagine how lost you could be in an
yeah,
ICU setting or somewhere where a patient actually needs you. So,
right.
just a pat on the back to you. Keep going.
Yeah, I couldn't second that more strongly, right? We gave you guys a lot tonight. Hopefully some of it sticks, some of it might not, but you know, try to reflect on, what we said and how it applies to the real world. And if you do, I think it'll make studying not just easier, but a lot more fun. Anything to add there, Jaden?
Nope. Keep going, guys. You got
Yeah,
this.
I second that. Appreciate everybody tuning in tonight. And we'll see you all on the next episode of the Jack Weston MCAT podcast. Take care, everybody.